In this video, I'm talking all about slow motion and how you can capture slow motion footage in your video camera. So let's get into it. So in the most basic way possible, video is made up of a series of still images. Now, depending on what type of video and what part of the world you're shooting your video in will depend on what frame rate you're going to be shooting in. But let's say you're making a video for a Hollywood blockbuster film. The typical standard industry is going to be 24 frames per second. And this means there's going to be 24 still images for 1 second of video. Now, the lower the frame rate or the less still images you have for 1 second of video, the choppier the footage is going to look. And if we go the opposite way, if we have more frames per second, so we have more images for 1 second of video, the smoother the footage is. Now, you want to essentially get your footage as close to 25 or 30 frames per second. So this essentially means that if you wanted to shoot footage at half the time of real time, so 50% slower than normal time, you would need to shoot double the frame rate. So if our standard frame rate is 24, for example, we want to double our frame rate to at least 48 frames per second. And then you want to slow that down in the edit by 50%. This means that when we slow down our 48 frames per second by 50%, we get 24. And this basically means that the video is going to play back really smooth and you're going to get nice slow motion. But if you wanted footage even slower than that, then you're going to need to increase your frame rate even more, because if you tried to slow down 48 frames per second by 75%, then you're going to end up with 12 frames per second again, and that is not going to look great. So if you wanted quarter speed, for example, you would need to quadruple your original frame rate. So we go 24, 48, 96. So in order to get your footage to play back at quarter time, you're going to need to quadruple to 96 frames per second at the bare minimum. And of course, this keeps going on and on and on. The higher the frame rate, the more you can slow your footage down in the edit, and the slower the video is going to be. So essentially, if you want slower footage, you need to increase your frame rate. The problem is though, you can't just adjust your frame rate. You need to adjust your shutter speed as well as your frame rate. Now, the basic rule of thumb for this is your shutter speed needs to be double the setting of your frame rate. So if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, for example, you're going to double that, so we get 48, and your shutter speed should be 1/48. This means if we were shooting in 100 frames per second, for example, then you would want to double that and get 200. So you would set your shutter speed to 1/200. Now, the reason why we have to ensure that the shutter speed is double the frame rate is because it makes the motion blur look natural. If the shutter speed was set too high, so let's say we were shooting in 48 frames per second and we set the shutter speed to 1/200, then it's going to look really choppy. And then we'll go the other way. Let's say we're shooting in 48 frames per second and we have our shutter speed at 1/50. The footage is going to be really delayed. There's going to be motion blur in the shot and it won't look pretty. So as long as you set your shutter speed double your frame rate, then you're going to have great looking footage. Now, when it comes to importing your footage into your video editor, one of two things is going to happen, and that depends on what camera that you're shooting on. Now, the first thing that might happen is it might import in real time, and you can use the speed/duration settings in your video editor to slow this down to slow motion. Or alternatively, if you have a more professional camera, then it might be imported in slow motion, and then you can speed this back up to real time using those speed/duration settings. So if you filmed in a higher frame rate and you increase your shutter speed, but you put your footage into the edit and it's playing back in real time, then it might just be because of the way the camera imports the footage. So try slowing it down and you'll find that it should play back in real nice slow motion. And there you go. That's the basics of how to shoot slow motion with your digital SLR camera. So thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your support, and I will see you on the next video. See you there.